13. Hark the herald angels sing. Jane Page's body lived pain. Sometimes it was a knife slicing her nerves, a fire consuming her skin, steel driving through her marrow. The softest, most intense pain slobbered in her eye sockets. Jane Page's mind lived pain. It danced round her soul with deceptive grace, striking delicate blows that paralysed her with agony. The instruments of mental pain were subtler. Old memories rose from her subconscious and into the hands of her torturer. The memories were hollow. They were real, but the events they described were false. Page vividly recalled a life she had never lived. That torture was worse than anything Gabriel had done. She remembered herself at school, a serious little girl studying the innocent faces of her classmates, watching for their weaknesses. A distant voice called her name. Her name. She tried to catch it, but the voice was weak. The girl who was not yet Jane Page rose behind her desk, repeating a mantra drummed into her from birth. Nation is strength, dum-de-dum. Blood is strength, dum-de-dum. Pain is strength, dum-dum. Nation is strength. That was the best joke Page had heard in years. Page's nation had never existed, and never would beyond the confines of her mind. It was a worthless concept, save for the value she lent it. She stared through a girl's untouched eyes at the Union flag on the class wall. Blood is strength. That was better. Page had blood. It was young blood, less than a day old and borrowed at that, but it was blood. Her strength was there, running through her veins. Pain is strength, Page thought. So I am strong. Girls grow up. Page grew to understand the meaning behind the mantra, the logic of society. She believed it. That was odd. She stared at the faces of the self-seeking bastards around her and wondered why she alone was so pure in intent. She'd learned to distinguish the extent of liberty, the need for strength to expand to its full capabilities, the fine distinction between freedom and the baseless chaos of anarchy. She understood the need for the national symbol, the role that racial and cultural purity played in the definition of strength, the need to establish arch-realism, to purge the individual of idiosyncratic morality. She had made herself strong, the strongest woman on an earth that didn't exist. The pain led her to the core of her beliefs. The pain showed her how little she was, how weak she was. Page screamed and raged and denied it with all the energy she could muster. But it was true. I wish, she said wistfully, I was a girl again. She wanted to cry, but there were gaps where her eyes should have been. Her face remained dry. She heard footsteps dragging along the corridor outside the door. This would be how she would have to live from now on, by sound. She would have to learn the fine distinctions between sounds, the subtle shades of silence. The door was opened, and footsteps pulled into the room. Then the door was closed. The newcomer stopped moving, became a voice. There you are, Page recognized it. Cranley? She hissed. No, came the reply in Cranley's voice. Then who are you? She asked cautiously, afraid it might be Gabriel. Cranley is part of us, Justin Cranley said. His mind was clean and new. We were dragged into its purity. We made him one of us, both of him. It is no longer the glass that focuses us. It is Cranley himself. I see, Page spat, considering sourly. You're my fellow shades, then. People without worlds, might have beens. We are. I am Cookselec, Cranley continued, his voice briefly becoming more relaxed and casual. I used to be a student. I must be going up in the hive, eh? We know you. You're a part of us. You belong with us. Page considered. The prospect was repulsive. It would be a descent into a crucible of impurity, losing herself in the heterogeneous mob. Join you, she replied coldly. That would be defeat. You're the weak, so weak you couldn't hang on to your own reality. It's survival of the fittest, remember, survival of the strong. Where I come from, we call it survival of the luckiest, Cranley Selleck spoke. Being in the right place at the right time. Paige purred. She pushed her body forward and shrieked into the darkness. I'm myself, Jane Page, and no one else. Her voice vanished with the sound. She couldn't see the effects of her words. Living by sounds wouldn't be enough. There would be no artistry to killing. She couldn't watch TV or see a sunset or a portrait. She could never read again. That struck her hardest. Without eyes, without sight, without words. She sank weakly into the chair in which she had been tortured. I am my own woman, she insisted. So we gather. Paige began. We can't have you arguing. You two should be all smiles and kisses and cuddles. Tanith's voice echoed through the shimmering blackness of Paige's world. She hadn't heard the woman enter. She assumed that Gabriel was with his sister, but the thought didn't move her. She felt nothing for him at all, not even hatred. Gabriel and Tanith were unpredictable, their actions pitched on such a higher level of thinking that attaching blame to them was unthinkable. She might as well rage against a storm, against the ocean, against the sky. Gabriel coughed, disturbing her brood. Little Miss Page is an individual. She should be allowed to do her own thing. I'd prefer to talk with Cranley. Yes, Cranley replied suspiciously. Paige sensed tension. The Doctor and Winterdawn have returned. They won't like us at all. Go, be our eyes, our hands, our agent in the midst of their camp. Silence ensued, short and tense. You want us to work for you? Cranley considered carefully. In a nutshell. Why? You owe us. We imagine you're keen on honouring debts. No, Cranley said sharply. Footsteps followed out of the room. Well, what do you make of that? Tanith said, faking offence. They've rejected us, Gabriel continued, and Paige felt certain that it was she who was being addressed. Our creations have cast us into the darkness. Oh, tragedy, tragedy, all is tragedy. They haven't the nerve to stand with you, Paige spat. They'd have to keep checking their shoulder blades for unexpected protrusions. We love our children. We would do nothing to harm them. Nothing much. Paige felt someone's hand on her shoulders. Gentle, smooth hands. It could have been either Gabriel or Tanith. She couldn't quite tell which. She felt something heavy drawn up onto her shoulders, sweeping round her like a cloak. She reached for it, her sore fingers finding thick, textured material wrapped over her forearms. What's this? She asked cautiously. A little something, it was Tanith's voice at her ear, to match the pretty pattern on your knickers. A flag, Gabriel snapped. The Union Jack, Tanith intoned, lending the words a significance that thrilled Paige. It also annoyed her. Flag! Union flag! We're 50 miles inland. No one's perfect, Tanith purred. You'll be wanting a trident and a lion next. Paige turned away from her, grinding her face up into a sour glare. Why? She growled, not expecting a sensible answer. Do we need a reason? Gabriel asked, closer this time. There was a casual arrogance in his voice that appealed to Paige. Your meaning is to have no meaning, Paige announced, more to clarify her own thoughts than to question the unseen pair. Exactly, Tanith clapped her hands behind her. You don't approve. Perhaps not. Paige adopted a twisted smile. She seized great bundles of the fabric hanging round her neck, drawing it tighter. She imagined her knuckles tensed and white. This is something different. Well, Gabriel said lazily. Better red, white, and true blue than dead, my country, left or right. And right is might, yes? Paige asked, imagining herself to be in the heart of a complex labyrinth of argument and counter-argument, a vocal maze where every syllable was laden with deep inflections and meanings. This, as far as she was concerned, was the key question. "Whatever you think, little girl," Gabriel replied. It sounded like the key answer. Paige nodded obsessively, feeling new forms of understanding blossoming in her mind. "I think I want a gun," she said simply. "I have a job to do." One of the couple, she knew which, pressed the butt of her pistol into her fist. She weighed the gun, running the fingers of her other hand over its harsh shape. It was perfect, untampered with and ready to fire. It would be simple enough to rake the room with bullets, smash Gabriel and Tanith's bodies beyond repair, but Paige knew better. Gabriel and Tanith were ambivalent, but not her true enemy. "I am the last of my race," Paige recognized, the quiet obsession in her voice, an obsession that might hold nations together. "This flag is meaningless. I must give it meaning. There must be a reckoning, a reassertion of strength and purity." "You're right, of course," Tanith sounded humbled. "How could we have doubted you?" "I am the Republic of Britain. I am the flag," Paige continued solemnly. "I am the charter. I am the executioner of state. I must seek out those who would seek to destroy me from within, the cancer on my body politic." "Atta girl," Gabriel was encouraging, "a true subject." "I am Britannia," Paige declaimed, rising from her throne, wrapping her flag around her. She was determined to see justice done, her image and wealth restored, and her enemies' thrones crushed beneath her size 7s. Gun in hand, she swept from the room. Behind her, Gabriel and Tanith broke into a rousing chorus of Rule Britannia. This was followed by a burst of what initially sounded like mocking laughter, but which she realized must be a round of applause and cheering distorted by the acoustics of the house. Jane Paige, assassin and Englishwoman, had found a new resolve. It was nice to have some sanity restored to her life. The first thing Ace saw when she returned to the cellar was the tetrahedron in the centre of the room, still emitting its pale blue glow, though its gentle throb seemed to have become less regular. Maybe it was just reacting to the chaos it had helped create. Ace couldn't care less. She knelt down and scooped it up. She selected the most offensive expletive in her vocabulary and whispered it into the light. It did not react, so she tossed it away without a second thought. She looked round, seeing grey walls, seeing the sarcophagus against the wall, seeing Winterdawn. He was sitting in his chair, hugging his daughter to him, demonstrating an affection which couldn't be denied. Ace felt jealous for a moment, then dismissed the thought angrily. She hadn't needed affection. She had grown up in a loveless world, and it had made her what she was. Basically okay. Good for her. She still suspected Winterdawn. Of what, she wasn't certain. Compared to Gabriel and Tanith, Winterdawn was almost likeable. But the suspicion lingered. This was a man capable of more than he seemed, Ace was certain. Perhaps the creation of Gabriel and Tanith hadn't been an accident. Perhaps he had planned it. The timing of his disappearance and the appearance of the couple seemed to fit together far too snugly to avoid suspicion. He loved his daughter. Ace knew this and almost felt guilt. Almost. She turned, seeing the doctor loom in the doorway. He was a dark shape, like a solid shadow. There was something about his introspection that infected the whole of his environment, creating patches of shadow in the brightest of rooms. Patches of silence, too. He hadn't said much since returning from the Gap. He slunk into the room like bad news, squatting down on the floor with his back to a wall. Ace joined him. She rarely admitted fear, but the doctor's mood was scaring her shitless. She could handle him when he was ranting. Silence wasn't something she could cope with. She lost track of what was going on inside his skull. "Did you find anyone?" she asked tentatively. The doctor replied with a curt shake of his head. His face was bloated, rank with despair. "What about Benny? Did you bring her body?" The doctor inclined his head away. When he spoke, his voice was a drone. "I couldn't bear to touch her." Ace said nothing. She knew the darkness he felt. "Ace, if this is finished, I'd like you to stay here. I don't want you travelling with me anymore." Ace shook her head coldly. The doctor continued insistently. "The thing is, I'm thinking of returning home. It's time I settled down. High time. You wouldn't like Gallifrey." Ace scowled, trying not to feel too offended by this show of weakness. "You're overreacting. A lot of people you know have died. A lot of people out there still need you. They don't know it, but they do." The doctor closed his eyes and again inclined his head away from her. "You know that if any of you were in danger, then I would tear out the cores of planets to help you. Believe me." He made it sound like a demand. "I can't go on. Benny's the last. She must be." "This isn't about Benny, is it?" Ace spat, keeping her voice restrained and whisper low. It sounded dangerous that way. "This is just another guilt trip. You're a total shit. Understand that?" The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "Of course I feel guilty," he said wistfully. "I'm bound to feel guilty." An edge crept into his voice, lining his words with new sharpness. "But I've spent the last couple of years of my life with Benny, and if you dare suggest that I haven't felt her death, then our friendship is over. Now." "Suits me," Ace heard herself say, but only in her head. She didn't like the way it sounded. "No," Ace said blandly. "Sorry." She blinked and was about to move away, to leave him to his own thoughts, when he whispered something that held her in a tighter grasp than if he'd physically grabbed her. "But there must be guilt." The doctor's voice was wistful again, as if remembering something. "And vengeance, and retribution." Ace's head jerked back to stare at him. "Gabriel and Tanith," the doctor continued. "They must be stopped." "Stopped?" "Annihilated, destroyed, killed." I don't sound like the doctor, do I? Ace closed her eyes and thought. "No, you sound exactly like the doctor, as he used to sound." "We'll do it now. It's safe to go back to the TARDIS. You can get your gun. I hate to say it, but I think brute force is going to serve us better than anything else." Ace studied the doctor's face in alarm, wondering how someone so infinitely clever could be so infinitely stupid. "I've told you," she snarled, pressing her face against his. "I've tried that. It doesn't bloody work." The doctor lowered his head, raising his hands to his eyes. Ace waited, wondering if he was crying beneath those fingers. He lowered his hands and stared at her with cold, needy eyes. "Ace, for pity's sake, I don't know what to do." "We have them up a gum tree, sis," said Gabriel. "They're stupid people." "Obviously," Tanith agreed. "Another diversion?" "I think we should just kill them. They've lost their novelty value." "There's still some mileage in Ace and Sandra. We'll get nothing from the doctor, but we've always known what a po-faced killjoy he is. The same goes for Winterdawn." "Sandra's our weak link, then." "Absolutely. Kill a few birds with one stone. Bloody big birds." "Now." It was the cry that alerted Ace. She turned, her immediate thought being that it was Winterdawn screaming. It wasn't. Winterdawn was choking, his daughter's hands locked around his throat. The only sounds he was making were quiet, agonized bursts of retching. No, the cry was coming from Sandra, an inhuman howl of bloodlust singing on her lips. Ace gaped for a moment, slow to react. Winterdawn's knuckles were writhing, clawing at the armrests of his chair. His eyes were pleading and bulging. His daughter's vicious animal face was reflected on his pupils. He didn't understand this, Ace could tell. He felt afraid and betrayed. She knew the feeling. She sprang forward, dragging Sandra's hands from her father's throat. They gave, but she didn't have the strength to wrench the daughter away from the father. Suddenly, the doctor was at her side, firm hands clasping onto Sandra's forearms, trying to force her back. "Must be a hormonal or chemical imbalance in her body," the doctor yelled, over Sandra's furious animal howls. "Yeah?" Ace yelled, finding an elbow lodged painfully in her stomach. She bent backwards, but wasn't weakened enough to release her grip. "They must be tapping into it, affecting the old brain, race memory centers. Goodbye to a million years of evolution." The doctor rattled off his words with the speed the situation demanded. Sandra's face was suddenly pushed into Ace's. Ace could see the blood-raw eyes, the saliva building on her teeth and gums. She was leaning forward in a perverse mockery of a kiss, trying to get close enough to Ace's throat to bite. Ace delivered a blow on the oncoming face with the flat of her hand. She received a stinging pain on her palm for her trouble. Sandra writhed in their grasp. The strength coursing through her limbs was too powerful for them to hold on for long, and Ace knew it. "The wardrobe!" Ace heard herself gasping desperately. "Look her in!" She saw the doctor nod savagely. It was an agonizing effort getting the spitting, hissing creature hauled across the room. It was even more of a strain shoving her into the sarcophagus and keeping her there while they jammed the door shut. But they managed it. Ace flopped against the wardrobe door, counting her bites and bruises, scowling with exhaustion and, perhaps, with a little desperation. Benny was dead, and this wasn't ever going to end. "She'll calm down in a minute," the doctor gasped. "Not much oxygen in there. The human body returns to its, default state to preserve the air." Ace nodded grimly, casting around the room. There was something missing. The room was too empty. There was a hole. She blinked and realized. Winterdawn! The muscles in Winterdawn's hands and wrists were aching. His palms were raw. Both hands were tightened round the wheels of his chair, jerking it forward in awkward bursts. His palms ground and chafed against the wheel treads in an attempt to shuffle himself faster along the corridor. Rage outweighed discomfort. He wasn't certain where he might find the monsters loose in his house. They were here somewhere, and he would find them, and then he would kill them. Sandra. They'd struck at him through his daughter. Through my daughter. Bastards. His teeth ground together, fighting the pain in his hands, the ache spreading up his arms. His gums were bleeding. They always bled when he was in a vicious mood, or doing something exceptionally physical, or both. The blood tasted watery in his mouth. Gabriel and Tanith. He didn't know them, he'd never met them, but he had created them. He had brought them into the world, however inadvertently, and he could destroy them. He remembered the ecstatic joy he'd felt over half his lifetime ago when he'd cradled Cassandra in his arms. There was no such joy now, simply loathing for the latest creatures he had fathered. They were children. He could reach into the cots of the newborn. The slightest pressure would shatter their necks. He would do that. He would. Really, he would. Twisting forward, he screamed, forcing his words with all the pressure his lungs could manage. "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you, you bastards?" "Watcher," said Gabriel and Tanith. They were barely a yard from him. Impressive figures in extravagant clothes. Winterdawn barely registered the details, but he absorbed the impression of the whole with hateful relish. These were Gabriel and Tanith. There could be no doubt about that. There was no innocence on their faces. There was just sharp cunning, arrogant hatred, and vicious hedonism. Their figures might have been specified from a catalogue, but their real shapes. They could have been a compound of everyone Winterdawn had loathed over the years, up to and including himself. They made his skin crawl on the inside. "You wanted to kill us." Gabriel stepped forward, his voice smooth and scornful, his eyes glowing with red fire. "Kill us. And how would you have done that, old man? Run us over?" Tanith laughed lightly. Winterdawn didn't laugh at all. Gabriel was close enough to touch. His pupils were balls of red flame. He seemed to grow taller, towering over the chair now. Winterdawn realized that Gabriel's feet weren't touching the ground. He pulled his head up again in time to see a hand falling towards his chest, a hand bunched into a short, powerful fist, a hand that burned with a halo of scarlet flame. Contact. Winterdawn screamed. The blow had struck lightly against his shoulder. It probably hadn't even bruised him. But the touch burned. There was no build-up, no charging of intensity, no slow and tortuous ascent to the peaks of pain. The pain was simply there, shrieking through him, and he shrieked with it. Beneath him, his chair creaked and shattered, collapsing underneath him. He fell backwards into a pile of twisted metal which would never resemble a seat again. Not that it mattered. Winterdawn expected to die soon, sometime in the next minute if the pain didn't let up. He lay flat on his back, trying to ignore the fear. Gabriel leant forward like a priest preparing to take a final confession. He said nothing. His eyes reflected nothing. He raised his red hands and pressed them against Winterdawn's face, cutting off the light but doubling the pain. Winterdawn spasmed, trying to ride the torment. The hands were pulled away. The pain remained, a ghost pain haunting his limbs. He didn't dare move. He doubted that he could. He was too frightened to think of doing anything. Tanith stood over him, legs parted, smiling lazily like a child on a summer day. Only the harsh blackness of her eyes robbed her of innocence. "Don't think we've finished," she said. "It's just my turn. That's all." That's all. She knelt beside him, reaching forward with hands that glowed orange. Winterdawn tried to pull himself away, tried to shout something, anything, but his tortured body betrayed him. Tanith laid her hands on Winterdawn's face. The pain returned in a new, different form. It had ceased to be pain, became a bland sensation that shook rather than stung Winterdawn's body. After a while, it almost seemed pleasurable. Tanith took her hands from his face and placed them on his knees. "Do you know how many connections there are in a single human nerve?" she asked casually. Winterdawn heard himself replying, equally casually, "Millions." Tanith nodded, and said nothing more. Her hands slipped between his knees and began to work up the inside of his legs, touching and stroking. Here was a new sensation, and one that Winterdawn hadn't expected. He stared thoughtfully at Tanith's face, at her precise, thoughtfully obsessed expression, and realized that for the first time since his wife died, he wanted to make love to a woman. To Tanith. Tanith knelt beside him. Gabriel stood at her shoulder. Winterdawn looked between their faces, trying to make the connection. "Get away from him, scum!" Winterdawn frowned, realizing that neither Gabriel nor Tanith had spoken. The voice belonged to the doctor's surviving companion and emanated from a distance from the far end of the passage. Tanith looked up from her work, then stepped away from Winterdawn. "You're too late," Gabriel was triumphant. "You're far, far too late." Then both of Winterdawn's newborn children turned and walked away the way they had come. A shape appeared at Winterdawn's shoulder, falling to her knees beside him. Ace's face loomed in the corner of his eye. "It's okay," she hollered back down the passage, presumably to the doctor. Winterdawn felt like adding deafness to his list of pains. "He's alive?" "That's debatable," Winterdawn muttered, but the woman didn't seem to hear him. The doctor appeared in his line of vision, opposite Ace. His expression was concerned, but it was a deadened concern, as if he had lost his zest for life. Winterdawn frowned, realizing that his own zest for life had just returned. "Do you have a spare chair we could get for you?" the doctor asked. Winterdawn stared with sharp eyes into the hollows in the doctor's face. Automatically, he broke into a fit of infectious laughter. "He's hysterical," Winterdawn heard Ace mutter. "Far from it," he spat in the spaces between giggles. He stretched out an arm, sweeping aside the fragments of metal and plastic, the pieces of the thing that had once been his chair, the cage that had bound him and frustrated him for 5 years. 5 years he'd wanted to cast it aside like junk. 5 years. Looking back was like trying to stare at the heart of an impenetrable black mist. His memories of the period were obscured by the hungry fog. For 5 years of his life, he had hidden himself in the darkness, alone and unloved. "We'll carry you," the doctor said, his voice slow and slurred. The world had become soft and tired. Winterdawn smiled. It was like a dream, an old, old dream. He raised his body on his elbows, forcing himself into a crouching position. From there, he followed old, barely remembered movements until he was once again standing on his feet. His legs shook after years of lifelessness, but they remained firm. The ground gradually stabilized under his feet. The doctor and Ace stared stunned. Winterdawn allowed him another smile at their expense. "Now," he asked, turning and trotting awkwardly back down the corridor to the cellar room, "how is Sandra?"